In 2013, in a sealed cave on the Red Sea coast of Egypt, archaeologists found a stack of papyrus rolls older than any writing ever recovered on the planet. They belong to a man named Mir, and what he wrote down quietly rewrites the story of the Great Pyramid. We are not going to tell you it was aliens, or magic, or a lost science we've since forgotten. We're going to tell you what a supervisor named Mir actually recorded about his own job. But that comes later. First, you need to understand the problem he was hired to solve. 2.3 million blocks of stone, some weighing as much as a small truck, stacked, fitted, and aligned to within a fraction of a degree, on the west bank of the Nile, around 4,500 years ago. Almost none of it was built by slaves with whips, the way old movies love to show it, and none of it needed help from anywhere but this planet. It needed something rarer, extraordinary organization. It starts across the river, at a quarry cut into a hillside of fine white limestone. This is Tura, on the Nile's east bank. Its limestone is fine-grained and pale, prized for the smooth outer casing of royal monuments. Getting a block loose from the bedrock was the first hard problem. Copper chisels were too soft for raw extraction alone, so the quarryman cut a groove around the block's edge, hammered in dry wooden wedges, then soaked them with water. Wood swells as it soaks. Swelling wood can crack solid stone clean along the line. For the harder, denser granite used deeper inside the pyramid, they used something even more patient, balls of dolerite, a stone harder than granite itself, pounded by hand for hours until the surface simply wore away, grain by grain. Once a block was free, it had to move. And this is where the sledge comes in. There is a painting inside the tomb of a nobleman named Jehuti-hotep, made centuries after Khufu, but showing a method that almost certainly reaches back to the Pyramid Age. It shows dozens of men hauling a massive stone statue on a wooden sledge, and one man, in front, pouring water onto the sand. For decades nobody knew why. Then, in 2014, a team of physicists actually tested it. Dry sand piles up in front of a sledge runners like a wall, doubling the effort needed to drag it. Add the right amount of water, and the sand grains bind together and go smooth. Friction drops by half. A team of 20 men could pull a 2-ton block on dry sand. On wetted sand, the same 20 men could pull it twice as fast, or pull something twice as heavy. Multiply that across thousands of blocks, and the water becomes as important as the rope. But dragging a block across flat sand is one problem. Getting 2.3 million of them across a river is another. So the builders waited for a gift the desert itself could never give them, the Nile flood. Every year, between July and October, the river rose and swallowed the floodplain for miles. For a few crucial weeks, boats could sail almost to the foot of the plateau itself, carrying cargo that would otherwise need to cross miles of open desert. The builders dug canals and basins to catch and hold that floodwater artificially, turning the plateau's edge into something like a working harbor for a few weeks a year, right where they needed it most. Granite for the burial chamber came the hardest way of all, 800 kilometers down the Nile from Aswan, where reddish granite bedrock outcrops along the riverbank. A single granite beam for the king's chamber's roof could weigh 80 tons. Loaded onto a barge, floated 1,000 kilometers downstream, then hauled the last stretch by sledge, the same water and sand trick, just for a heavier stone. So, quarry it, wedge it loose, drag it on wet sand, float it on the flood. That gets a block to the base of the plateau. It does not get it to the top of a monument taller than a 40-story building. For that, you need a ramp. And this is where honest archaeology admits something refreshing: we are not entirely sure which kind. The oldest idea is the simplest, one long straight ramp of packed earth and rubble, running from the desert floor up to the working level, extended and steepened as the pyramid grew. The problem is basic geometry. To keep the incline gentle enough to drag heavy sledges, a straight ramp tall enough to reach the summit would have needed more material than the pyramid itself, and would have buried the finished monument's face until the very end. So other archaeologists proposed a ramp that wound around the outside of the pyramid like a spiral staircase, growing taller with each course of stone, using far less material for the same rise. That solves the material problem, but creates a new one. A spiral ramp would cover the corners needed to keep checking the pyramid's angles and alignment as it rose, at exactly the moments precision mattered most. A French architect named Jean-Pierre Houdin proposed a third option in the 2000s, an internal ramp, spiraling up through the pyramid's own body, hidden inside the masonry, invisible once the outer casing was added. In 2017, a team using cosmic ray scans, muon detectors that can see through solid stone the way an X-ray sees through skin, found a genuine hidden void above the Grand Gallery, roughly the size of a passenger jet. Nobody has fully explained what it is. Whether it connects to Howden's ramp theory or is something else entirely is still an open question. The likely truth is less tidy than any single theory, different ramps, in different combinations, at different stages, adjusted as the builders learned what worked. Ancient Egyptian engineers were not following one blueprint. They were solving a new problem with every course of stone. So who were the people doing the solving? For a long time the popular answer was slaves, driven by the whip, dying by the thousands. That story is almost entirely wrong. South of the pyramids, archaeologists led by Mark Lehner uncovered an entire lost town, bakeries, breweries, dormitories, a hospital, built to house and feed a workforce on a massive scale. The bakeries alone could have produced enough bread daily to feed thousands. The breweries turned out beer by the vat, a staple wage, not a luxury. Animal bones tell an even sharper story. The workers ate beef, a high-status food usually reserved for the wealthy, in quantities that suggest a workforce that was valued, not disposable. Skeletons from the workers' cemetery show healed fractures, set and mended, evidence of medical care given to injured laborers rather than bodies discarded where they fell. Graffiti scrawled on hidden blocks inside the pyramid itself named some of these work gangs directly: friends of Khufu, drunkards of Menkaure, teams with pride, rivalry, and their own identity. The real system was closer to national service than slavery, farmers conscripted for a rotating tour of duty, likely during the Nile flood months when their fields were underwater anyway, fed, housed, and organized in shifts, then sent home. It was, in effect, the largest and most complex employer the ancient world had ever seen, run with a bureaucracy that tracked food, tools, and labor down to the day. Which brings us to the theory that refuses to die, that none of this was really possible without outside help. That someone, or something, from beyond Earth must have lent a hand. It is an understandable reaction. The scale is staggering, the precision is real, and it is genuinely hard to picture, from a modern chair, exactly how patient hand labor adds up to a mountain of fitted stone. But every piece of that puzzle, the wedges, the wet sand, the flood canals, the ramps, the bakeries, the bones, the graffiti, is documented, tested, and consistent. The moment you add it all up honestly, the mystery does not vanish. It just changes shape, from magic to organization. Which brings us back to Mira, and the papyrus we started with. In 2013, a French team led by Pierre Taulet was excavating a set of sealed caves at Wadi al-Jaf, on Egypt's Red Sea coast, an ancient harbor with no obvious connection to a pyramid 200 kilometers inland. Inside, they found the oldest inscribed papyri ever recovered anywhere on Earth. A logbook, kept day by day, in the 27th year of the reign of a king named Khufu. The author signed his own name to the record, Mira, an inspector in charge of a work gang of about 40 men. It is, in effect, the oldest surviving diary in human history. And it is not vague. Mira logged the date of every shift, the tasks his gang performed, and the trips his boat made, up and down a stretch of the Nile and its canals, for months on end. Again and again, one entry repeats: his gang traveled to the limestone quarries at Tura, loaded blocks onto their boat, and sailed them to a place Mira calls Akhet Khufu, the horizon of Khufu. That name is not a mystery to Egyptologists. It is the pyramid complex at Giza itself, referred to by its own ceremonial name, in real time, by a man who was helping to build it. Mir records his gang making the round trip from Tura to Giza roughly every 2 to 3 days, delivering load after load of casing stone, month after month, one entry at a time. He names his superiors too. He answers to an official called Ankhaif, a real historical figure known from other inscriptions as Khufu's own half-brother and a senior overseer of the entire project. In other words, this was not a myth, not a legend written centuries later. It is a shift log, kept by a working supervisor, naming his boss, his boat, his gang, and his cargo, in the very years the pyramid was rising. And it matches the ground. Around the same years Taulet was reading Mira's diary, a separate team led by Mark Lehner was digging up the actual harbor basin at the foot of the Giza plateau that Mira's boats would have sailed into. 2 independent digs, one reading a 200-kilometer distant papyrus, one reading the mud at Giza itself, converged on the same physical system: quarry, canal, boat, harbor, ramp, block, placed by hand, logged by name. That is the reveal. Not aliens. Not a lost civilization. a real man named Mir, and a diary that sat in a sealed cave for 4,500 years, waiting to confirm exactly how patient, organized, human labor raised the largest stone monument on Earth. It took a lifetime to build. Khufu's reign lasted roughly 23 years, and the Great Pyramid consumed most of it, stone by stone, flood season by flood season. When it was finished, it was cased entirely in polished white Tura limestone, blazing in the sun, visible for miles across the desert, a finish that has almost entirely worn away or been stripped for later buildings today. For nearly 4,000 years, it was the tallest structure human beings had ever built. Nothing surpassed it until the medieval cathedrals of Europe, and nothing else from the ancient world has lasted anywhere near as intact. So return to the real question, the one worth asking instead of aliens: how does a Bronze Age kingdom, with no iron, no pulleys, no wheeled transport across sand, organize this? The answer is that ancient Egypt was not a kingdom of simple farmers with occasional genius. It was, by the time of Khufu, one of the most administratively sophisticated states that had ever existed. It could conscript, feed, house, and rotate tens of thousands of workers a year. It could track a supply chain running 800 kilometers from Aswan and 200 from the Red Sea coast, all converging on one plateau. That is not a lesser achievement than anti-gravity or laser cutting. In some ways it is a harder one, because it depends entirely on getting thousands of human beings to cooperate, for decades, without the whole system collapsing. Modern engineers who have tried to replicate even small sections of the pyramid, using only period tools, confirm this. The methods work. They are simply slow, exhausting, and merciless on the schedule of anyone in charge. Which is exactly why a diary like Mir's matters so much. It is not a grand story of destiny. It is a tired supervisor's paperwork, complaining, in effect, about another long shift moving stone. And that mundane, bureaucratic ordinariness is exactly what makes it more convincing than any theory involving lost civilizations. Nobody fakes a shift log for lost gods. People only keep shift logs for jobs. So the next time someone tells you the pyramids are too perfect for ancient hands, you can tell them about Mir. A real man, with a real boss, a real boat, and a real quota of stone to deliver every few days, for years. He never knew his diary would survive. He never knew it would still be legible 45 centuries later, in a cave he probably never expected anyone to open again. But it did survive. And what it says, in the plainest words, is, we built it ourselves, one boatload at a time. Clear away the myths, the ancient aliens, the lost super science, and what remains is not a smaller story. It is a far bigger one, an entire civilization, organized down to the boatload, moving mountains with rope, water, patience, and time. Farmers who became sailors for a season, sailors who became stonemasons, stonemasons who signed their gangs' names on stones nobody was ever meant to see again. A bureaucracy patient enough to track every trip, every loaf of bread, every jar of beer, across 23 years, without ever writing the word impossible. This is the true legacy of the Great Pyramid. Not a puzzle for outsiders to solve, but a mirror held up to what people, ordinary people, can build when the whole of a society decides to build it together. Every wedge soaked, every load logged, every gang proud enough to carve its own name. That is what actually stands on the Giza plateau. Not the wreckage of a machine we've since forgotten how to build. The signature of a civilization that never doubted it could. Mir's diary is still there today, in a museum case in Cairo, a stack of dry papyrus that outlasted the empire that made it, and every theory invented to replace it. Built,